Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books, and we are continuing the Progressive Plantation by uh, Lorenzo Kom'boa Ervin. And we start with the section Anti-Racist Action. Who said you were an anti-racist ally? For years now, it has been made apparent to me that the idea of white people creating and leading anti-racist movements of other whites is total nonsense. I have had to learn this through bitter experience from dealing with groups like the Anti-Racist Action, Love and Rage, and others on the left that white people have no real clue how to fight racism, and if they do, they certainly are refusing to demonstrate it in real fashion. The apparent strategies of these groups is to chase after neo-Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan, the Church of the Creator, and others to upstage them and disrupt their racist events. Although I fully understand that we must confront fascist paramilitary movements, this alone is a flawed strategy, however, and no more eliminates racism than dancing in the streets. But it makes white people feel they are accomplishing something, and it certainly does help with recruitment. But as a person of color, I do not feel this movement in any way ensures my safety from violence by right-wing paramilitaries or the police, the latter of which kill upwards of 1,000 people each year. Yes, I acknowledge the Klan is dangerous, but this is not the 1920s, when they had millions of members. The truth is, these white radical groups deal with racism from a totally white perspective. They generally have no ties or accountability to the black POC communities and do not work with activists of color except in a strictly token and manipulative fashion. This leads to serious isolation from the communities of color and dangerously backwards ideals about racism, which they feel are academic anyway. Some years ago, I attended an ARA convention in Columbus, Ohio. Columbus is the home of Ohio State University, and at least a third of the city's population is black, but there were hardly any other black people in attendance except one guy who called himself a black skinhead, a middle-aged black woman, and a few other people of color, maybe 20 in all. It was clear to me that there had been no attempt to bring in folks from the black communities in Columbus and other Ohio communities with substantial black populations like Cleveland or Cincinnati. They did not even attempt to bring black students off the OSU University campus. Thus, you had this weird spectacle of hundreds of white people in a huge auditorium arguing and giving sanctimonious speeches about racism, from which most blacks POC were excluded. In addition, in attendance was every alphabet soup leftist sect you can or can't think of. The SWP, ISO, IWW, SL, SLP, Love and Rage, and so on, under the banner of anti-racist action. At some point during the plenary session, to which I was hurriedly added, while an older black woman was speaking about her experiences with racism, a white radical jumped out of the crowd, rushed up to one of the microphones, and blurted out, "You shut up, we know what racism is." This crystallized for me an instant in what is wrong with such white-led anti-racist groups with other mother country radicals generally. They have arrogantly convinced themselves, because of academic study and reflection, that they do know that they know what racism is, even better than the people who experience it daily. How they know that and what it is that they claim to know is really an open question. Racism is a lived experience by peoples of color, not something easily given to textbook study. To be an outcast, an object of derision and violence, merely because of pigment, race, or custom is not something that most white people can grasp. White radicals may claim to understand it intellectually, but it is not the same. Yet to me, the very idea that white people profess to know more about racism than peoples of color themselves is a really peculiar type of arrogance. It is why white radicals are so disliked and distrusted in the black community. Many times they disrespect you, all while claiming to be allied with you or opposed to racial chauvinism. That is unacceptable. It is interesting that almost none of the white people in attendance in the conference contradicted the disruptors or defended the black woman's right to speak. I can only remember myself and the other people of color shouting them down, along with one white guy, Michael Novick, who was on stage with us. We afterwards became friends, but I recall coming away with a very bitter feeling overall. The next day, I pulled all the people of color together to issue a statement denouncing the incident and calling for them to do the same. Because they were caught off guard, the leaders of the conference agreed with our criticisms at the meeting, but then some weeks later they barred me from all subsequent ARA meetings for my racial disruption. For years, I was an outcast. In fact, it has just been recently, since the old Columbus leadership has been discredited, that any ARA people would even speak to me, and then only the folks in Los Angeles, where Michael Novick is situated. I consider Novick one of the few anti-racist whites who gets it, and whom I generally respect. While not everyone agrees with me in ARA, at least because of Novick, they might listen and would not demonize me in his presence. Maybe we can even build a new movement in different principles and including peoples of color instead of white radicals in command. Certainly, the LA ARA chapter is doing this already with its alliance with the Black Riders Liberation Party and other POC radicals. For those of you reading this, please do not take these criticisms to mean that I think everyone in groups like ARA are enemies or are as bad as the Klan, as some of my past critics in the group claimed. Someone even tried to claim that I just did not like white people, which is so absurd that it does not require a response. I do not at all believe that, never have believed it for that matter, but because of such experiences I have observed or been victimized by, I now think it is useless to believe that the white-led movement or anti-racist organizations can build a mass movement of just white peoples to end racism, or even for radical social change for that matter. The whole movement must change. If it is not accountable to peoples of color, such as an anti-racist movement is a detriment. These arrogant, white-led movements I have been speaking of serve as proof positive that if the victims of racism are not at the front ranks of these anti-racist movements, it will merely serve white interests and not be an ally of the black and other oppressed peoples. Now that is as clear as I can make it. The most effective anti-racist movement this country has ever seen, the Southern Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 1960s, was led by activists from the black community, and the fact that it had ties to poor and working class black peoples in the community. In spite of its middle class leadership, it allowed it to really conduct campaigns that altered the socioeconomic and political face of the country and win major gains for blacks and poor people. It is little known by most, but true, that the black working class community was in fact the backbone of the movement, even though the mass media has always concentrated on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as the major figure in that movement. It was a movement of oppressed victims of racism, not white liberal or radicals who played a minor role. This is contrary to today's movement, made up of primarily white middle-class activists. Because of this situation, we can say this censures today's anti-racist movement can only speak for white middle-class people, not victims of racism, poverty, or police brutality. I feel that there is definite lessons here for anyone who wants to see it, the question must be asked, is this an anti-racist movement at all, but in fact an example of a white rights movement? Although I am clear white people cannot lead an anti-racist movement without being accountable to peoples of color, I also feel they must confront their own racism and that of white people generally within the movement for social change. Through internal seminars, study groups, and other forms of political education, but mainly through serious struggle internally. This should take place in every progressive and radical organization, but especially within anarchist and anti-racist organizations, which have serious problems with diversity and racial exclusion. The questions of whiteness, white supremacy, and white privilege must be ruthlessly dealt with among white people themselves, and then they must be made accountable to peoples of color instead of posturing as anti-racists above racism themselves. The truth is that I have not known many white political activists willing to deal with internal racism inside their movements. Instead, they prefer to posture as being without any racist ideology and practice and then allege themselves to be a serious force to organize against external racist right-wing movements. This is a gross error, which they must resolve before they really constitute a force against racism. But looking within is a hard, dangerous task most white, male-dominated radical groups avoid like the plague, preferring to feel in their arrogance and superiority that they have the answers to all of society's problems, and that everyone else should just listen and follow them blindly. This is dishonest and opportunist. It is important to recognize that no movement like this can be made successful and truly liberating to all. But we must be honest and admit that such a movement is in line with the prevailing beliefs of this country that feels it can free white people while leaving people of color in slavery. The first American Revolution was based on that belief, so it should be no surprise that many white radicals also believe that the coming revolutions will be based on their white privileged concepts of revolutionary change. They see themselves at the center of things, and nothing happens unless they lead it, but they refuse to challenge their own racism and privilege. Can white people be re-educated? Yes, but they must be willing to change and follow the leadership of folks who have suffered historically from racism and internal colonialism. The fact is, what routinely happens to peoples of color, the murders, the beatings by police, mass unemployment, community-wide poverty, mass imprisonment, and record infant mortality, and so many other effects of structural racism and internal colonialism rarely happen to white people. And that is why when it does, to any degree, it is called fascism. Yet, since the 1960s, white radicals have focused on right-wing paramilitary movements rather than the rise of the corporate state, the mass imprisonment of peoples of color, and paramilitary policing in communities of color. Fascist paramilitary movements. Fascism is not to be debated, it is to be smashed. Buenaventura Durruti, Spanish anarchist revolutionary, 1936. While I don't believe fascist paramilitary movements are the greatest threats to people of color, or are on the verge of seizing state power, they are dangerous and must be confronted in the streets. I have always seen the struggle against paramilitary fascist movements as important, especially giving the anarchists the ability to work in white working class communities, where I am convinced much of the ideological undermining of fascism has to take place. This is where many working class anti-fascists will be drawn from, but this is not the main anti-racist force in society. That is the movement by peoples of color themselves, as I make clear in other articles in this book. In my mind, it is not possible to just debate trained killers. They must be stopped by any means necessary. I also believe that the government has to be exposed, must be stopped for coddling and using these forces to smash the left and anarchist tendencies and liberation movements of color. As the anti-racist action groups and many other activists have learned, merely beating up fascists without doing grassroots work does not make for a viable movement campaign. We have to go beyond these confrontations and reach the people susceptible to their fascist propaganda. As capitalist society decays, people will look for radical and total solutions to the misery they face. The Nazis, the Klan, are among the few right-wing political forces that offer, or appear to offer, a radical answer to the current problems of society for the white masses. That these solutions are false will matter little to confused and hysterical people searching desperately for a way out of the socio-economic crisis the capitalist world is facing. Sections of the middle class, better off layers of the white working class, poor and unemployed white workers, all poisoned by the racism of this society, are easy prey for Nazi and Klan demagogues. They demand a scapegoat, blacks on welfare, high immigration rates, too many women in the workforce, and other simplistic targets to vent their frustrations at. The Nazis, skinheads, the now defunct Church of the Creator, and the Klan are the most extreme right-wing fascist organizations in the United States, but the militia movement and the so-called Oath Keepers, made up of police, active duty military, are in numerous states and are clearly a right-wing death squad in the making. Since this has been written, they have come more to the forefront as an aside by me. Today, these groups are small, and many liberals, like the American Civil Liberties Union, downplay the threat they represent, even to argue for their legal rights to spread their racist venom. But these groups have a tremendous growth and potential and could become a mass movement quickly, especially during an economic and political crisis into which we are now entering. Basing themselves on alienated white social forces, the Nazis, Klan, and other fascist groups are trying to build a mass movement that can hire itself out to the capitalists at the proper moment and assume state power. When the capitalists feel they might need an additional club to keep the workers and the oppressed in line, they will turn to the Nazis, Klan, and similar right-wing organizations with both money and support, in addition to strengthening the state, police, and military forces. If need be, the capitalists will place them in power, as they did in Spain, Germany, and Italy in the 1920s and 30s, so the fascists will smash the unions and other working-class organizations, place blacks, Latinos, gays, Asians, and Jews into concentration camps, and turn the rest of the workers into state slaves. Fascism is the ultimate authoritarian society when in power, even though it has changed its face to a mixture of crude racism and smoother racism in the modern democratic state. Other right-wing forces have been on the rise in the last 25 years. They include ultra-conservative rightist politicians and Christian fundamentalist preachers, along with the extreme right section of the capitalist ruling class itself, small business owners, talk show hosts like Rush Limbaugh, and the Christian televangelists, along with the professors, economists, philosophers, and others in academia, providing the ideological weaponry for the capitalist offensive against the workers and oppressed people. Not all the racists wear sheets. Thank you, Little Leon. Viva Anarchista. Okay. These are offensive against the workers and oppressed people. Not all the racists wear sheets. These are the respectable racists, the new right conservatives, the Tea Party, which arose in 2009, who are far more dangerous than the Klan or the Nazis because their politics have become acceptable to large masses of white workers, who in turn blame racial minorities for their problems. The Tea Party, especially, has changed mainstream politics and our respectable conservatives, the dominant political tendency of this period. The capitalist class has already shown their willingness to use the conservative movement as a smokescreen for an attack on the labor movement, black struggle, and the entire working class poor. Many city public workers have been fired. Schools, hospitals, and other social services have been curtailed. Government agencies have been privatized. Welfare rolls have been cut drastically, and the budgets of city and state governments slashed. They have even taken away the traditional rights of collective bargaining. Banks have even used their dictatorial powers to demand massive municipal and state budget cuts, and to even make entire cities default if they did not submit. In turn, the states were foolish enough to invest pension and operational funds in the stock market, so they stand on verge of going bankrupt. This bankruptcy even happened in New York City in the 1970s and in other major metropolitan areas since. So it is not just an issue of poor, dumb rednecks and hoods. This is about government and corporate hoods and business suits selling workers out to Wall Street. A first step in organizing and preparing the working class in the economic crisis we face is to directly take on the right-wing threat. Repressive economic legislation by conservative politicians to punish the poor and working class must be defeated. Taxes on the rich and major corporations must be increased, while taxes on the workers and farmers must be abolished. If the politicians will not do it, we will organize a tax boycott to force them to do it. It is part of the same battleground. None other than Adolf Hitler has been quoted saying, "Only one thing could have stopped our movement. If our adversaries had understood its principle and from the first day had smashed with the utmost brutality the nucleus of our new movement, well, we should now take heed and destroy the paramilitary. We should now take heed and destroy the paramilitary right wing and the electoral Tea Party in this period now, with a mass anti-fascist, anti-racist movement led by POC. Another prong of our strategy is to organize among the workers and the other oppressed sections of society with a program that addresses their needs. As has been said, the Klan and Nazis recruit among social layers. Overwhelmingly, white youth who are hard-pressed by the economic crisis. These people see blacks, Latinos, gays, Asians, women, and radical movements as a threat. They are racist, reactionary, and potentially very violent. Fearful that they will lose the little they have, they buy the myth that the problem is those people trying to steal their jobs, homes, future, etc., rather than the decay of the capitalist system. As long as there appears to be no alternative to fighting over a shrinking social pie, the fascists, with their simple-minded solutions, will get a hearing among the degenerate elements of the working class. The only way to undercut the appeal of the right is to organize a liberation socialist workers' movement that can fight for and win things the people need: jobs, decent housing and school, health care. This can demonstrate concretely that there is an alternative to the right wing's poisonous solutions and can win the ranks of the workers' movement. Some of those people attracted to the fascist movement. In all our areas of organizing, we must carry out consistent revolutionary propaganda explaining capitalism is responsible for unemployment, rising prices, rotten schools and housing, and the rest of the decay we see around us. We must expose the fact that while the Nazis, Klan, and other right-wingers make blacks, gays, Latinos, and other oppressed people the scapegoat for the economic crisis, their real aim is to destroy the entire movement for social change, commit genocide, start an anti-imperialistic war, and turn workers into outright slaves of the state. Therefore, these fascist forces are a threat to all workers of every nationality. It must be explained that they only want to use white workers as pawns in their scheme to create a fascist dictatorship, and all workers must unite and fight back and overthrow the state if they are to be free. Now, this is not easy when there is such opportunism and internal racism inside the left itself, but it is something that must be done. I can't possibly be a racist. There is this illusion among white radicals and progressives generally that if they declare themselves to be some sort of radical activist, this proves that they and their movements cannot possibly be racist. But as we have discussed, white racism works inside all social movements, even those who make the claim that they are opposed to or exist to fight racism. Part of the problem is that they believe that if they do not personally take any harmful action against a black or non-white person, and maybe even give them a few privileges out of their bag of white privileges, that this proves that they must be excused from the standard definitions of a racist. Only problem is that there are not any standard definitions, no template or other method to know if someone is a racist other than what they do, and sometimes even that is not enough. A white radical, like a white person, generally have middle class privileges in a white racist society. And it does not matter about their personal beliefs. The white left is brilliant at self-deception and pointing at the right wing as the racist we must crush is certainly one of them, but they also neglect to point the finger at themselves. They are also a force helping to oppress peoples of color and keep them disempowered for the white masters on high to continue their rule. Their control over social change movements, their access to capital, the middle-class lifestyle afforded them, and the mystique and social power of whiteness puts them in a favored position vis-a-vis poor people who generally have nothing. So, just their very existence as white people means they profit from oppression, even if they don't make racist pronouncements or join the KKK or Tea Party. White social change movements have always had a love-hate relationship with the rest of white society, but with the rise of the nonprofit organizations in the 1970s, they became the keeper of the flame and the agent of liberal wing of capitalism. After laws on corporate giving to nonprofit social action movements were changed, a large wing of the primarily white left changed their political orientation to pacifism and left civil rights activism. This was actually a subversion of existing social movements from the left to finish destroying the autonomous black POC movements and allow these new nonprofits from the left to destroy these new nonprofit radical social change movements to take their place. Of course, everyone realized they were selling out to capitalism and racism. Their role was to co-opt and make unnecessary autonomous local political movements and deliver their bones to the capitalist bosses. In that sense, they worked hand in glove with government repression programs COINTELPRO, who was doing the real killing and subversion of groups like the Black Panther Party. These white radical social justice groups always have had access to more capital than any of the autonomous movements of color, and so they can use that to challenge, co-opt, and crush autonomous movements of color. Internally, they carry out a purely white radical agenda, although they sometimes hire POC faces to trick the public, even communities of color, that they are both tolerant and are their anti-racist allies. Inside these groups, they make sure that the white people really control things and that the POC are just window dressing. They mislead would-be radical movements into the most tame, white middle-class activism possible. They do not actually oppose government officials, except in the most limited, safe fashion possible to obtain the passage of regulations or passive reforms. They do not advocate or believe in revolutionary organizing, and do not break the law except in permitted instances using nonviolent protest actions. They actually keep the capitalists in power. I'm not the first author to say this. 2 books, Pacifism as Pathology by Ward Churchill, and How Nonviolence Protects the Government by Peter Gelderloos very forcefully made the case. I am saying it as a person of color who has directly suffered at the hands of such groups and know firsthand that pacifism is a retrograde force and will lead us to defeatism ultimately. Thank you, and please follow for more videos.